YouTube channel, Connect with Steph. So today I'm going to be talking about flexible working requests and the changes that taken place in the legislation effective as of the 6th of April 2024. However, what I want to talk about, just before we talk about what the changes are, let's go back and talk about what was in place prior to the changes. So prior to the changes in April, an employee had to have 26 weeks continuous service with their employer before they could submit a flexible working request. An employee could only submit one flexible working request per year. And then the employer had 3 months in which to make a decision, in which to consider the request and make a decision as to whether they would accept or reject the request. And then finally, the employee had to say, as part of their request, why they're making the change and how that change would impact the business. So that was what was in place prior to the change. Then once the legislation was updated, which was effective as of the 6th of April this year, the changes were an employee can now apply for flexible working from day one of their employment, so they no longer have to have 26 continuous weeks. An employee can now submit 2 flexible working requests per year. The employer now has 2 months, so the time is reduced from 3 to 2. So the employer now has 2 months in which to consider and make a decision in regards to their flexible working request. And the employee no longer, as part of their request, no longer needs to say how this will impact the business. So it's not a legal requirement anymore for them to say how, but it may help if you're trying to persuade your employer to accept that request. So any employee can submit a flexible working request. I'm more focused on those that are returning to work from maternity leave. However, some of the guidance on here applies to any employee when it comes to flexible working requests. But if you are on maternity leave and you're planning to return to work and you want to submit a flexible working request, what you need to remember is that an employer has 2 months in which to consider and make a decision on your flexible working request. So it makes good sense to submit your flexible working request whilst on maternity leave and submitting that request as early as you can, as a minimum at least 2 months, but ideally 3 to 4 months before you're due to return to work. So this gives the opportunity for the employer to kind of consider and make a decision on your request. And then if the outcome of that request is that that they decided that actually they can't support that request and your request is not upheld, then you have the opportunity to, then you should be able to have the opportunity to appeal. And if the appeal was rejected, then you've still got a bit of time to think of a plan B. But please note that there is no statutory requirement for an employer to actually let you kind of do an appeal. So it's really important that you look at your policy to see if there's an appeals process, because there's no legal requirement for an employer to hold an appeal. So have a look to see what your policy says, because ACAS, even though there's no legal requirement, ACAS do recommend that employers do put in an appeals process. So if there is no appeals process, please speak to your HR department or speak to ACAS to see what alternatives there can be if you're not happy with the outcome of your flexible working request. When you are making your flexible working request, make sure that your request is in writing, and ideally send this via email so that you've got a date stamp and a time stamp, so you can work out when your employer needs to respond to you in regards to their decision. So what you need to understand is that with the legislation for flexible working requests, the legislation is that you have the right to request a flexible working. However, that means you have the right to request it. It does not mean that the employer has to accept your working request. Because I know that some people, some employees think that, right, I've submitted the request, that it has to be approved. That is not the case. So just remember, the legislation is there to say that you have the right to request it, so you're able to put in the request. Your employer has to consider that request, but that does not mean that the employer has to accept your request. If your employer is going to reject your request, then there are 8 legitimate business reasons in which they are able to reject your flexible working request. Number 1, if your request is going to cause extra costs that will damage the business. Number 2, if the work cannot be reorganised amongst other staff. Number 3, if other people cannot be recruited to do the work. Number 4, flexible working will affect the quality of the work. Number 5, flexible working will affect the performance of you and the team. Number 6, the business will not be able to meet customer demand. Number 7, there's a lack of work to do during the proposed time. Number 8, the business is planning changes to the workforce. So the business should give you detailed reasons behind those headings, and they can use one or more of those reasons as to why they're unable to accept your flexible working request. If your request is accepted, then you should receive confirmation in writing confirming the changes to your terms and conditions. So, if your organisation is unable to accept your flexible working request and they have given you one or more legitimate business reasons as to why they're unable to accept your flexible working request, then unfortunately I think it will be time to actually think of what is your plan B. What are you going to do now? Can you just continue working as you were previously prior to going on maternity leave, or do you now need to seriously think about what is your next step and what are you going to do in the future? So I hope that helps. Obviously, if you do have any queries, then I always suggest that you go and speak to your HR department, or if you're not sure about speaking to your HR department, then you can speak to ACAS, and ACAS will provide free guidance in regards to any employment query that you do have. Thank you for watching. If you've got anything that you'd like to add in regards to what I've discussed so far, just comment in the section below. And if I could ask you nicely, so far I've got 19 lovely subscribers, so thank you for those who have subscribed to date. But if I could just ask if you could hit that subscribe button, and then you can get notified whenever I upload a new video. Thank you for watching.